George Iler, I-L-E-R,
the place of birth,
Milton, Illinois,
and the date,
January 15th, 28.
your branch of service,
Navy,
your highest rank,
good old seaman, deck.
the dates that you enlisted and when you ended your service time.
Yeah, I enlisted, I was nearing 18, but I enlisted down in the volunteer state of Tennessee. My dad was working down there at the time. And if your grades, they had a deal. If your grades were real good, the first semester of your senior year, if you wanted to join the service, you could, and still get your diploma. And because they were still wanting them to join up and everything, see. So anyway, I didn't want nothing to do with the Army. Laying in the mud and eating cold rations and never getting a shower sometimes for weeks and so forth and so on. And in the meantime, bullets are whizzing around you and everything. And I've always loved the rivers and the lakes and the water. So I wanted to join the Navy because I had an older cousin that was in the Navy pre-war. He was on a battleship in Pearl Harbor that got sank. Well, anyway, I knew that they got their laundry done. They had hot meals 3 times a day. They could take warm showers, soapy, every night before they went to bed or early every morning. In other words, it was you might get into some bad trouble if you was on the wrong ship or something, but at least you was going to die clean and happy and your belly full. So anyway, I joined the Navy, and that's why I was in that branch.
Could you? What were the dates? When did you first go? Do you remember the date when you first enlisted? What year it was?
It was January the 14th. I think it was 45. My birthday is January the 15th. And they'd also let you enlist back then, a little bit early.
Do you recall your first days of service? What was that like for you?
Oh, yeah, that was boot camp out in San Diego, California. I'd played football all through my high school, and we had a tough teacher that put us through boot camp for 4 years in high school, getting us ready so we could really be tough when we went in, see. I won't tell you how many push-ups we could do, or how many sit-ups we could do, or how far and hard we could run, because nobody believes me when I do tell them. But he had us ready. So I enjoyed boot camp. It killed about half of the guys, and but I'd just breeze right through it and loved it.
Do you remember anything about the instructors? How were they like during your training?
In boot camp?
Yeah.
Oh, they were fine. They were non-com officers, like first class yeoman or whatever, that would have what did they call 160 men in the Navy? The Navy and the Army all have different, well anyway, the barracks out there in San Diego would hold 160 men. Well, this first class, and usually he'd been in the old Navy, have 4, 5, 6 of the stripes on his, each one of those was for 4 years. And so anyway, they tried to be tough, hard-nosed and everything. You had to learn how to wash your own clothes and tie them, your pants, your shirts and everything, and your underwear. Roll it and tie it with a square knot, and then hang it on they had a big mast. And they had these lines with going around pulleys. Well, when you washed by hand all your clothes, wrung them dry and everything, there was a certain way you had to tie them onto that line. On that pulley, they went way up that mast. And most of them were square knots that you had to use. Well, anyway, then they'd hoist them way up. The sun and the wind and everything, and dry them, and keep the wrinkles out of them. But then when you took them down, you had to fold them an exact way so that everything would fit in that little old canvas knapsack, So anyway, I didn't have no trouble with all that. And when I was growing up, I was an only child. And it was during the Depression, and everybody said, George is going to be a spoiled brat. He's the only child. And his dad was one of the few men that had a pretty fair job and in the Depression. And all my relatives and the neighbors and everybody said, oh, no, George will never be a spoiled brat. They said he's his mother's daughter and he's his father's son. I learned how to cook, and I could put good meals out. I could cook pies and cakes and everything the old way. There wasn't opening up a box and putting it in. And the secret of delicious cookies and candy and crust on the pies and everything is something that you got to almost order from a supermarket anymore to get it. Lard. Old-fashioned, pure white lard, which we would render out ourselves. We'd kill all of our own meat. Back in them days, there wasn't any electricity, no refrigeration, no nothing like you got it today. And that pure lard, the reason you can't buy it anymore, they say it'll kill you. It's 100% cholesterol. Nobody back when I was young and growing up and we was all using this pure white poison had ever heard of cholesterol, knew what it was. Now with all of these fancy oils and stuff, everybody's got high cholesterol. You got to watch how much you eat of that. Well, you work for one thing, but anyway, the crust and the cookies and the candy, you'd put a bite in your mouth, and it would just, your tongue, it would just dissolve, boy. And now, you know what crusts are on most of the stuff. Well, I went through that era when people had to do things themselves. And so, anything they threw at me in the service was a piece of pie. I knew how to handle or do all of it, So I never, ever had any trouble getting along in the service.
Which war did you serve in?
Huh?
Which war did you serve in? Which war did you serve in?
2.
Okay. And when you were there, what were some of the places you went to?
Well, I was lucky. The war had practically was over. In fact, by the time I got out of boot camp, the Japanese had the atomic bombs dropped on them and had signed on the Missouri surrender. Well, anyway, they put me on a troop ship and headed me out, and I ended up in the Philippines very briefly, just a week or so, and they put me on another troop ship, and we went to Yokosuka, Japan. That was a big Navy harbor that the Japs had big dry docks, and we saw all of the bombed out and burned out battleships and carriers and everything. And they put me on a big AO, auxiliary oiler, and that was the third largest ship in the Navy. Battleships or an aircraft carrier was the only thing that was any longer and bigger than it. So anyway, I did get in on a huge naval mock war operation. They put a big fleet together, and we went to Sydney, Australia. And they wanted me to take the big picture of it and my little souvenirs off, but they're glued permanently to my walls over there. So anyway, we was the center of that fleet because we was 9,000 miles out in the middle of the Pacific. And if we would have hit some mines, or there were still a few Japanese holdouts here and there, you know. And if they would have tried to sink us and got us, that whole fleet, 2 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 8 cruisers in a ring around them, and 22 or 4 destroyers in a big ring all out around them and moving across the Pacific. Well, if they would have, the enemy would have been able to have sunk us, blowed us up, they'd have been helpless to anything that was enemy. Stuck out in the middle of 9,000 miles of ocean and no fuel. But anyway, they put us right in the center. We was the most protected thing on the face of the earth. And they even had a submarine going along under us because sonar was almost non-existent. It was brand new. And they put that submarine down there under us trying to be able to detect if one of those stray Japanese submarines that hadn't surrendered yet would sneak in under all of the others, they could sink us and leave them all helpless, see. Well, that was kind of important deal, and I've got my plaques there, the only treasures I got from exploits in the Navy. I've got a green octopus card. That's awarded when you go completely around the world. And this oiler I was on in the next 2 years, I could have had 10 or 12 of those. That's how much traveling we do. We'd pump off hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel to Navy vessels and Navy aircraft on the aircraft carriers, and right back to Bahrain, Arabia in the Persian Gulf, and get another big full load and take off again. Well, anyway, and then they had, when your ship crossed the equator, you got a little certificate called you was a shellback. And you got initiated humiliatingly, as any sailor knows. But then if you crossed that equator at the international date line, which goes all the way around the world, threaded the needle on the middle of the X, you got a big certificate, golden shell back. And it's got your sea nymphs and all that stuff in full color and everything on it. Well, anyway, I've got that there with big pictures of my ship. But anyway, then when we got done with that, that's when went back to Yokosuka, and they had hospital ships and repair ships and everything in the harbor. Well, they put me on a little what they call a YOG, yard oiler, and it only had 20 guys on it, smaller, and it could navigate the water in the bay. And so when all of these ships, the hospital ships and the repair ships and everything, they ran 24 hours a day. Bright lights like a city, everything going, machinery and refrigeration and everything on them. Well, we would have to go out and meet ships like this big one that I was on that hauled almost I forget what it was, 1 million gallons of different grades of oil and gas, and they'd get a load of that off of that big ship, and they could bring it in, and they'd pull up beside these big ships that was permanently anchored up to the shoreline and pump it off for them to run all of their generators and lights and everything. Well, anyway, I spent about 3 months on that thing, and after about the first 2 weeks, it only had one cook. Counting the cook, 21 men. And we'd tie up to the big rock seawall along in the harbor there, and the cook, his time run out or something. Anyway, they got rid of him. And somehow or other he was asking some of them if any of them could cook, and they said, told him that I could, because I had sometimes cooked up some batches of cookies and stuff, real good. So anyway, he looked at me and he says, "Is that right, Iler?" And I said, "Yeah." He says, "You're our new cook. Didn't ask you nothing, And now he was just a chief. And he got addressed as captain of that little old YOG. Officers now, real officers, laugh that even went on, Well, anyway, you had to do what he was the captain, although it was a junky little thing, But anyway, they tied up, and they didn't have SPs. They weren't organized at all. They didn't have SPs yet. They didn't have your military currency, money yet, anything. You used the Japanese yen for everything, souvenirs and Japanese beer and women, and was all done. And the way you got the yen was like I say, there was no shore patrols. You just wore your old like this, dungarees and work shirts and everything. When after supper was over, you just strolled up the gangplank and out through a big yard that was loaded with warehouses, and right out onto the main thoroughfare, and you went on liberty. And as long as you was there by breakfast time and work time the next morning, nobody said anything. In other words, it was all unorganized yet. So anyway, he wouldn't give me any help. It ended up, I was working 12 to 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, never getting to go with my other 20 buddies over and have all of that so-called fun. And I was there cleaning up. I had to clean up all the pots, the pans, the dishes, get the stuff for breakfast set out on the counters ready to cook. And hell, they were coming back from having all their fun and everything by the time I was getting that all clean and ready, see. And I'd have to get up an hour, hour and a half, at least earlier of a morning, and get in that kitchen and cook them all a big delicious breakfast and everything, you know. And then I had to clean all of that up. Then I had to really fix a big delicious dinner, which I could do. By that time, if you was a cook, you made your list out, and they went across. We had landing ship craft that was our ferry, taxi any place we wanted to go. They'd run over one of those supply ships. I could get big, delicious hams. I could get big turkeys. I could get big hens. I could get frying chickens. I could get slabs of good smoked bacon and cut it myself, because I was also a meat cutter. Cut it in because they liked it a little thicker than what we get it now. Well, anyway, and I'd bake them homemade biscuits and sour the cream myself to make the biscuits, and then the gravy and everything. I could cook the old-time way, which everybody just licked their chops all the time. But anyway, it all took time when you're by yourself and cooking for that many and cleaning up all of the messes and the pots and the pans and everything. Well, the captain, the chief, had a young Japanese boy as his boy. And he'd wash his clothes, press them, clean them for him. He'd do everything for this so-called captain. Well, anyway, he didn't have to do anything hardly at all. And he was a young guy, about 18, that had just completed his kamikaze training. Right after Okinawa and everything had just ended, his group that had been trained were the next ones to be sent out, because they never come back, any of them, you know. Well, anyway, he didn't have to go, and it ended up on our ship, see. So anyway, I told my captain that I thought I should have some help, that it was just too much. If I did the cooking and the cleaning right, it was just too much for that many guys, 3 times a day. He says, nope, I can't spare any of the others. And I said, well, how about, I forget the name they called him. And he says, no, he's my boy. And we all suspected he was really his boy, if you know what I mean, too, because he didn't go over ashore much. The captain did. Well, anyway, he said, nope, you're doing a fine job. He said, just dismiss me, see. Well, I told him, I said, hey, I'm not going to take this forever. He says, you will. He says, or I'll have you up for a court-martial, captain's mast. Well, I let another week or so go by, and I saw him at it. And I thought, superior officer, so-called, or not, he can't treat me like a slave. Even back then, you know. And so anyway, I didn't cook supper. And the guys all started hollering, and they knew what the score was, and they didn't think I had guts enough to do it either. And I said, what can the captain's mast do to me? When they hear the full story, they've got to release me. Let me go. All you got to do is demand a transfer. And he's got to give it to you under those supposed conditions. So anyway, Pretty soon, here come that Japanese boy. He says, "Captain's dinner." He was beginning to learn a few words, you know. And I said, "No." He looked at me, and I said, "You go tell him he don't get no dinner." Boy, he looked at me. He turned around and he left. And boy, he was back in just a minute. And he says, "Captain says dinner or to the brig you go." I said, "Go tell him I'll gladly go to the brig." He went back and told him, but boy, he come down. Have you ever seen guys so mad that a blood vessel was sticking out on their temples or their head? I thought he was going to have a stroke or a heart attack. He raved and ranted at me, and I refused. And he says, "You go in and you pack all your clothes." And he says, "I'll send the first class guy with the landing ship over to the flagship," or whatever they called it. And he says, you'll be court-martialed. You'll be sorry the day you refused orders." And I said, "Okay." It didn't worry me. And he didn't send me over. I got all packed, had everything all rolled and tied so it would all go in the damn sea bag and everything. And I was waiting to go. And it came, and he canceled it. Well, the next day, he called me up. He had some other guys makeshift making breakfast and everything. And he says, "You got your sea bag packed?" And I said, "Yeah." He says, "Good." He says, "Put it in, I forget the number, the name they had for the landing ship thing." He says, "I'm going to fix your, you know what." He said, "You'll be sorry." He says, "See that big ship out there?" Well, hell, it was, sure, I seen it. They had to anchor way out in deep water, you know. I'd been out there dozens of times already. Well, anyway, he says, "You will be on board that ship, and it never pulls into any friendly ports. It goes into the Saudi Arabian peninsula there and takes on oil. And the Shah and all them didn't allow any Americans to come over and go into their little towns where the oil fields were and everything. Their religion, you know, was really strict. Well, anyway, once in a while I'd throw a beer and sandwich party on the beautiful white sand in that Persian Gulf and let us swim and everything, but that was it. And sure enough, away we'd go all around the world someplace, dumping all that oil off and gas, you know. Well, anyway, that happened just shortly, and we got sent back to Yokosuka. And they had just by then, they had just started having the military currency, and you saw guys running around with their SP. They was beginning to get things organized, you know. Well, anyway, I saw all my old buddies and everything, and they said, "How do you like your hell ship?" And I said, "It ain't a hell ship." I said, "We've had Liberty and Athens, Greece already, Gibraltar," and I named off some towns that they would pull in for 2 days out in the harbors. The port, half of the ship would go over and get drunk and find him a girl and come back. And the next day, starboard, see there's port and starboard on big ships, they would get to go over and do the same thing. And the minute they got back, up come the huge big anchors, and off we were gone again for about 2 months. And then, by then, things were starting to settle down around the world, and you regularly, I think it was 2 months was the longest they could keep you at sea without having a little fun in some port, you know. Well, anyway, that went on for 2 years, and I saw the world. Today, it would cost you not 1 million, but millions of dollars to get to go where I have been and what I've seen, and most of all, what I did all over the world, and got little green cards to prove it, you know. Well, anyway, it turned out I thoroughly enjoyed every day of my stint in the Navy. And I would have, if I hadn't have been an only child, my mother's daughter and my father's son, and the whole family was tight like they used to be back then. And I had sent a few cards kidding my mom and dad, but they didn't. I knew they wouldn't know that I was kidding, about how we would be in these foreign ports like Japan and Singapore and around, you know, and how they had the cutest little girls, and we had fun giving them baths and then powdering them down, making them smell good, and then we'd take them to our bunk and sleep with them and everything, see. Well, what they didn't know, there was this little Spitz dogs that we'd picked up there in Japan, and they were small enough and everything that you could get away with having a pet on board. You wasn't supposed to, but they would. Well, anyway, we'd all have our folks just, really raving and ranting about us. Don't you dare bring one of them foreign gals home as a bride and everything, see. Well, anyway, we finally started sending pictures of Dixie, our little girl, you know. But anyway, I got to thinking, weighing it all, the pros and cons. And I didn't want to break my mom and dad's hearts and everything, so I didn't re-enlist. I went home. And I don't regret it, but there's many, many times I wonder if I hadn't have been better off staying 20, 25 years in the Navy. But I also, when I was away and everything, whether to stay in, there wasn't too much of the world that I hadn't had some liberty in one of the countries or the ports, you know. Seoul, Korea, Athens, Greece, Singapore, all over, down in Australia. So I didn't really have too much of a yearn to maybe go do that all my life anymore. So anyway, I ended up back down in Tennessee. The atomic bomb plant was slowed down there at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. They were starting on a new, more powerful bomb up in Paducah, Kentucky, the hydrogen bomb. So anyway, my dad had moved up there to where Kentucky Lake was. Some of the best fishing in the whole United States. But anyway, I got old enough that I didn't stay there very long, live with them. Went back to my roots down there in Pike County, along the Illinois River, Bluff Country, God's country they called it. And no electricity. There wasn't any electricity, this is hard to believe, in a 10-mile long stretch by 2.5, 3 miles wide back from the river. Did not get electricity until 1961. They say it was the last decent stretch of ground in the whole state of Illinois to get any electricity. That's how wild and rugged it was down there. But I loved it. You lived in the same climate and circumstances as the Indians thousands of years ago. You treaded along the same bluffs, the same big trees, springs, uncountable, so many of them. Every once in a while there'd be a break in these long bluffs down there. They called it a valley. They'd go back up toward the flat country. Well, all along those valleys would be little creeks coming into one big creek. Ice cold water, purer than what you're paying, what, $1.50 a bottle for in some places now. And you didn't know which rabbit or which squirrel to shoot first. Game was so thick. It was like a jungle, woods, there, all of that. And there was deer, which the rest of Illinois didn't have. And you didn't advertise it too much, but you had deer in the wintertime too. But you had to cut your own wood. There was no gas, no modern ways of heating. You cut wood, big stuff, put it in long cords, even with the top of your head. Had big round steel stoves, round oaks they called them, that you had to heat with. And if you was too damn lazy to go out and cut about 2 huge long rows of that firewood, you could freeze to death, because winters were something else back then. You ask anybody my age, and a lot of them here at the home that are older than that, they'll tell you, that's right. A lot of people say, oh yeah, sure, snows were deeper, ice stayed froze longer and everything. But it's the truth. Our climate has changed. And as far as I'm concerned, part of it, America got transformed immediately after the end of World War II. There was no such thing as a chainsaw until then. There was no such thing as big bulldozers. They were developed even during the war. And those two things changed the face of America in the next 20, 25, 30 years. And 4-lane highways, nobody even dreamed or drew pictures of such a thing back in them days. But the roads up in the 1950s late, down in that stretch, was either dirt yet or gravel, creek gravel. And very few fences and no electricity. You didn't need ice or a refrigerator, because you didn't have to go but a very short few steps. There was an ice cold. I mean, it'd hurt your teeth if you had a cavity beginning to form or something. And it would keep your milk. It would keep your butter. It would keep the buttermilk good. There weren't the germs, bacteria back then either, that there is anymore, longer. And you dug trenches and put your apples and late peaches and pears in these trenches. Lay some straw down. Put down a layer of apples, other fruit, put another layer of straw, and you'd build it on up to where there was just a little mound of dirt that you'd put over it so it was still loose. And you'd do the same thing for your fresh vegetables. Carrots, turnips, celery, all of the so-called vigorous vegetables, because there wasn't any. Even places, you had to be in a place like the size of Quincy, where railroads were starting to bring that kind of stuff from out the West Coast or up from Florida. But even towns the size of Quincy didn't have fresh vegetables all the time, all winter long, nor fruit all winter long. unless the railroad happened to. They were the first to start moving stuff like that. But anyway, I knew how to do all of that the old way. Cure the meat, can it, cook it and can it, and make it in meatballs, some of it. And boy, when you'd get up and make them buttermilk biscuits, all on a wood stove, an oven, and then put that home-cured ham and that homemade gravy and meat, ground up, maybe hog and rabbits together, so it was lean to help take care of all the fat of the hogs and everything, see. But anyway, people eat better then than they do now, even with all your fresh stuff and frozen stuff. But you had to prepare for it, or you didn't hardly survive through a winter. But I longed to get back to that too, because that hadn't got modernized yet. That was another reason that I didn't sign over in the Navy. I was torn between the Navy and the way of life that I was born into and raised in. So I've had a very full life, and as my dad said, "Son, we have lived in the finest time of this earth, from the time God formed it until now." He says, "You and I both lived where nothing but horses pulled wagons, or you rode the horses, or you had surreys, and everything was done with horses. From that up to the Model Ts and then the Model As, no roads, so to speak, yet even then, but up through the years, the airplane all of a sudden was discovered. Baldwin, right here in Quincy, was the first man to make gas balloons. They were popular for a few years. And Quincy had more multimillionaires than towns 10 and 20 times its size back in the late teens, the 19s, and the early 20s, and the Depression. I can take you out on 28th Street, 30th Street for blocks and blocks and show you where factories, some of them gone now, but elevators for buildings invented right here in Quincy by a guy named, last name was Otis. They still build them with his name on them yet today. They're the finest ones around the world. But there was electric wheel. There was Mormon Manufacturing, who pioneered medicine food to make animals healthier and everything. There was Monroe, who invented putnam dyes, and that was known all over the United States for dyeing clothes and everything. And Stillwells, I can name you all of them. You've probably went out through the east end of town, saw all of them beautiful old mansions. Quincy had more millionaires and entrepreneurs that become rich than any place in the whole United States, with even more population than it had. And old Clyde Adams, when the Depression hit, he had a store and barge, the old wooden barges down at the front of Front Street. He was the only millionaire in the whole United States. There was a few of them, but they all had their money all tied up. If they saw a chance to really make a killing, if they had $1 million, it'd take them a while to gather it up, have to do some consolidating and everything. Old Clyde Adams could walk up to the bank any time. I want $1 million in cash. And they would have put it in satchels and give it to him. He was a true millionaire. And you know the section of town, but where the colored district used to be, he had owned out around 8th and 9th and 10th and Chestnut and out in there. He owned several blocks of 3- and 4-story old wooden shacks, whole blocks of them. And the ground floors were dirt, but those people rented them and lived in them from him. And that was part of the way he got his millions. But Quincy, I could do a 10-hour talk on Quincy's history.